Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much again for being here today. I'm João Albino Pimentel, University of South Carolina. I'm currently with the STR Membership Engagement Committee and very glad to moderate this session in the context of STR Division's alternative career paths. So after we had this interesting session on industry careers, we decided that this growing phenomenon in our field is for people to consider postdoctoral programs. Well, an alternative to the so-called standard approach of pursuing a PhD in strategy and then going for an assistant professor position in a tenure track. So I thank Heather Berry for the idea of organizing this event. We were also very lucky to count with 4 fantastic speakers who accepted to share their experiences with us today. They all pursued PhD postdoc programs for different reasons. Each will give different perspectives on what is the value of these programs for us. They will talk about every aspect of postdoc programs from before entering the program, what to do while you are in this program, and how to use it afterwards for the next steps in your careers. So if any topic is not covered in their presentations, please ask questions. So we'll first have Louise Morris from Copenhagen Business School. Let me show her picture here. Yes, so Louise has a PhD from INSEAD and did a postdoc at MIT. She can tell more about her career later. Second, we'll have Cinziana Dorambatu from NYU Stern, whose PhD was in political science from Duke and a postdoc at the Wharton School. Then Panicos Georgolis, now at the University of Amsterdam. Panicos was my fellow PhD student at HEC Paris, and he did a postdoc at the University of Michigan. And finally, I'm hiding his credentials. We have Leandro Nardi, fellow from Brazil, who did his PhD in strategy at INSPER and now is pursuing a postdoc at HEC Paris. So each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes in their main talk. Then we'll have a lot of time for the Q&A portion of this session. You can choose to write questions in the chat, in which case I will ask these questions later on, or you can wait for Q&A and ask your questions yourself in person. So without much further ado, I give the word to Louise.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction, João. So hello everybody, my name is Louise Morris, and as João mentioned, I'm at the Copenhagen Business School. Before joining Copenhagen Business School, I was at the London Business School, which I actually joined after doing my postdoc at MIT. And I have a PhD from INSEAD. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my postdoc experience. And let me just start by saying that my postdoc experience is a little bit idiosyncratic. It's also a bit outdated. So I think those that will come after me may have some more interesting information for recent postdocs to share. Back when I did a postdoc, there were not many formal postdoc positions in management, whereas now it's becoming more common. So I spent 2 years as a postdoc at the Sloan School at MIT in 2004 to 2006. So it makes me feel very old to say that. And I worked with Roberto Fernandez, one of the senior faculty members, on a project there. Roberto had a project, he had some data he was working on and had an idea for a project. And so we started working on that. We didn't know if it was going to become a paper, but I started to work with him on some data, and then it actually turned out that we ended up with publication out of it. So that was a very good experience for me. I also worked on my own papers coming out of my dissertation during that time. So that was a very good experience for me. I had no teaching, and it was also unpaid. And let me tell you more about why that was the case. So as I mentioned, back when I did this postdoc, there were not many postdoc positions. And in fact, there was no formal postdoc position at MIT. So what happened was I went on the job market back in 2004. And at that time, there were not many positions. And believe it or not, at that time, also coming out of a European PhD program, it was difficult to get a position in the US, and I wanted to get a position in the US. Many of those schools in Europe, it wasn't quite clear. People felt at some of the European schools that they weren't sure if you had gotten proper training coming out of a European school, even coming out of INSEAD actually at that time. And I even heard through my network, oh, if Louisa goes and pursues a postdoc, maybe then we'll be sure she's really serious about research. And so one of my committee members happened to know Roberto Fernandez really well and reached out to hear if he knew of any postdoc positions. And she also put in a good word for me, and it so happened that he had this project. And so then the connection was made. Coming out of Denmark, there are lots of great foundations and research grants and so on. So I optimistically applied for research grants, hoping that I was going to be able to fund my postdoc at MIT. That fell through, but I did manage to get my postdoc position there because I was able to say, look, I can come. I know you don't have a formal position, but I will be funded on my own. So that's how my position came about and why I chose to do it, and also why it's a little bit different than I think if you go and apply for formal positions. So I was just going to share one slide here to talk a little bit about some of the learnings from my experiences, and then we can talk about the other experiences after that. So I'm hoping you can now see this slide. So some of the advantages of doing a postdoc is that it allows you to deepen your learning. For me, very much, it gave me access to a very different research environment that I came out of at INSEAD. I also got to work with different persons who became to me more like a second advisor. So I had advisors at INSEAD, but now I actually added someone to that list. So I learned a lot from working with Roberto, and also being of course, in the research environment at MIT. INSEAD is a great environment, but so is MIT. It's also a great way to widen your network. I was able to attend seminars at MIT, but also to attend some other seminars in Boston. So to go to, for example, I attended the economic sociology seminar series that also were hosted at Harvard. And then you also get to, of course, meet the doctoral students at that other institution or other postdocs. I also, there were 2 other postdocs at MIT at the Sloan School when I was there, and they became part of my network. And you also get to know the faculty, of course, at that institution. So it's really a great way to widen your network, which of course you will take with you throughout your career. It's also, of course, I was lucky it happened that I got a publication out of it with the advisor at the host institution. And then, of course, you get the opportunity to get more feedback on your own dissertation work. I was able to present at MIT and get some great feedback from people there. And that's also been helpful in my learning, and also in actually, I think, publishing my own main dissertation paper, which I presented there. Then it's also a way, in my experience, as you heard, I was saying, coming out of Europe at the time, it was a way for me to help gain some legitimacy by doing a postdoc, furthering my PhD experience, and also spending time at this different institution, which of course then you can also put on your CV and take with you as part of your network. Then there's also something about time. So you get more time before you end up with a full teaching load, and you start with the pressures of being on a tenure track position. But I would give a little bit of a warning here, because I think if you've already spent 6 to 7 years on your PhD, then it's a lot longer to go that want to do a postdoc. I actually happened to finish my PhD in 4.5 years. So I was relatively quick. And so for me to add on those 2 years did not make a big difference. But of course, once you start on tenure track, the clock starts ticking, as we know, in terms of tenure. So getting those 2 extra years and working on your dissertation papers is great. What are some of the disadvantages? So with my particular experience, you really need to rely on your network. But I do think that's also true if you rely on applying for a formal position. I think very often you're more likely to get the position if you know someone or your advisor knows someone at the school. So that's a helpful way to get a foot in the door. That's of course also true when you're applying for jobs. Do make sure you secure funding in advance if the position is not funded. So I ended up having to fund my own postdoc. In the long term, we can say I was able to do it. So I was fortunate I had the funds to do it. But of course, in the long term, it's a great investment in your career. And I would not go back and say I wouldn't want to do it. But of course, I cannot recommend that all PhD students should do that. The disadvantage is also there's a longer time before you start the tenure track. And of course, that on the one hand, you get the extra time to work on your papers, but it's also time where you don't have a stable income in the same way as you do once you get your first job. And then there's also a downside in terms of the job market. So when the initial conversations I had with Roberto about MIT was that I would just be there for 1 year. But in the end, I said that's not possible for me, because the problem with doing a postdoc position for 1 year is that as soon as you arrive, you have to go on the job market. And that is just extremely stressful. You won't have time to enjoy your time as a postdoc. You're basically going to spend the time there being concerned with the job market. So I would say minimum 2 years. If you can go 3 years, that's even better. Once we get into longer than 3 years, then I think you'd probably want to look for a job. But I would never encourage anyone to accept a 1 year postdoc position unless if it's really your only option, because then you just end up being on job market straight away. Okay, so I think that's all I have to share at the moment. I'm very happy to take questions at any point.
Thank you, Louise. So we move now to Cinzi.
Thank you very much, Joao. Louise, it was really fascinating to listen to your presentation, and really happy to have a chance to build on that. I want to say from the very beginning that, as Joao said at the beginning in the introductions, my PhD was in political science. So my background is in a completely different discipline. More specifically, it was I concentrated in political economy, which itself is a sort of strange field that sits at the intersection of political science and economics. And in the course of my dissertation, I discovered that I'm interested in firms. And something very, very bizarre happened to me at that point. I went to my committee and I said, I'm working on this dissertation, which was looking at government policies to regulate the entry and the investment of foreign companies, multinational companies. So I'm looking at policy, which is something that is obviously fits very nicely with political science, but I also want to understand firms. I don't think they're these passive observers of the policy. Sometimes they're trying to shape the policy. Sometimes they're clearly influenced by it. So how can I bring this into my dissertation? And my committee members, despite being incredibly smart people, looked at me fascinated and said, why? Why would you ever want to study firms? I didn't have a good answer, but I still had this instinct that I wanted to understand a little bit about firms, how they fit into this picture, how they're this interesting black boxes from the perspective of political science that take policy, respond to policy, do something, and then here comes the economic outcomes that are studied in political economy. So I was having these conversations with my committee. I was getting absolutely nowhere. And in a little bit sort of discouraged by that, I started thinking about options outside of academia. And during this time, I had the incredible sort of fortune of meeting several people. Bennett Zellner was a professor of strategy at the business school at Duke. He's longtime co-author. Vit Henish was a professor, is still a professor at Wharton. Both of them have been working on topics on international business, global strategy, very good, compatible with my interest in political economy, and specifically multinational and policy on multinationals. And then they introduced me to Mauro Guillen, who at the time was running the Lauder Institute at Wharton. And a couple of things happened. So this is very idiosyncratic. And Louise also mentioned that a lot of these postdocs and a lot of postdoc experiences tend to be very, very idiosyncratic. Mauro at the time had the dream, he was running the Lauder Institute, and he had a dream of creating a postdoctoral program that would give people from other disciplines related to strategy an opportunity to consider careers in business school. Mauro was saying out loud that, he himself is an economic sociologist, but he thought that other disciplines need to be represented in business schools because they have, they can bring something. And political scientists was one of them. He also believed that business schools need anthropologists and historians, and we need to have, he wanted to put together a postdoc program to facilitate that. And he did, because he was in charge of the Lauder Institute. I was incredibly lucky that he started it just the year after I finished my PhD. So the first cohort, I was part of the first cohort of that program. And it had 3 political economists coming from 3 different schools, again, considering careers in business school academia and making a decision whether they want to stay or go a different way. And in the second cohort, there was a historian, an anthropologist, and a sociologist, just to give you a sense of the flavor. So it was very much a program that was intended to encourage people from other disciplines to consider coming into a business school. And at the same time, Vit was applying for a very, very large grant to fund a very big project. And part of my postdoctoral position was also funded by that. And so there were 3 sources of funding. I had the luck to be funded in my postdoc, in part, and I think a big chunk of it came from the Lauder Institute, from a research grant that Vit obtained, and also from teaching. I was teaching a course every 2 sections of a course every spring. So I think I want to just emphasize a couple of things that Louise mentioned, and then move on and kind of talk about how I think about postdocs in different fields. But for me, it was a great opportunity, because I was coming from a different discipline, to extend my education and to educate myself in this new field that I was moving into. So I took some doctoral classes. Essentially, I audited them because I needed them. And I spent my time working on this postdoc project that was associated with a grant that Vit received. So one thing that I did at that point in time, because I knew I was making this transition, I completely put my dissertation aside. My postdoc was from 2010 to 2012. I never spent another day trying to publish my dissertation. I still love my dissertation. I really enjoyed writing it. I still learned a lot by writing it, but I never tried to do that. So I spent all my time on a brand new postdoctoral project, sort of ideas that I started talking about with Vit before I even went to Wharton, and doing the teaching and doing the sort of auditing classes in this new field that I was studying. It also helped me, it was a 2-year position. It gave me a chance to spend some time socializing into a new community. One thing that was very, very surprising to me at the time was how socialized the strategy and management fields are compared to other social sciences. In fields like political science, and I think this applies to sociology and economics as well, nobody knows PhD students. Nobody spends time, invests into getting to know PhD students, because there's so many of them. And because in business schools, the number of PhD students, the ratio of PhD students to faculty is considerably smaller by an order of magnitude. Faculty at different institutions get a chance to meet with PhD students, other institutions. So by the time you go on the market, some people know you, not everybody knows you, of course, but some people in your own community know you. So I spent some time going to conferences and trying to get to know people, kind of make up for the fact that I, coming from a completely different field, plus completely very, very under-socialized. So I want to switch a little bit and talk about the fact that there's all sorts of flavors of postdocs, some very informal, some formal, some happen like in a very idiosyncratic way like mine did, but then some are very institutionalized. So the Lauder Institute had for about 3 or 4 years this doctoral program that I was part of, and then it folded. I think there are fields like in OB, postdocs are more common. I know because we have, in my department, we have a postdoctoral position for someone to run the behavioral lab, right? So that's part of their position. It's a 2-year position. They get hired. It's a search like a search for a junior faculty. The person gets hired, they run the lab, they have a chance to work on research for a year, it's all their research, and they can start new research with faculty, of course, and then the second year they're on the market, and then we start recruiting again, right? So it's a very institutionalized, very clear thing. There are also some centers who have these positions, sometimes it's it's hard to find them, you kind of have to ask around, and you have to figure out where they are. And I think it's even harder to sometimes to know about them because they tend to have very different names. So my official title while I was at Wharton was senior fellow. I don't know what senior fellow really means. I was a postdoctoral fellow, but there was no postdoctoral in that title. That's what I was hired for. More recently, I think there's a number of schools, this is the case for NYU, that have started president or provost postdoctoral fellowships. I know we have a provost fellowship. It's funded from the provost's office. So I think that's one of the important things to mention, that are sort of the higher in the organization, the more access to resources. But it's to some extent it is intended to encourage kind of a diversity hiring approach, right? To give people from different backgrounds a chance to spend some time at top research institutions and give them a leg up in their careers. And then the other thing, there's one more flavor that I've heard about or learned. There are these sort of visiting positions that happen somewhere between the defense of the PhD or just before the defense of the PhD, that are in effect some postdoctoral positions, but again they can have a very different title, and they tend to be more ad hoc, right? So it's someone who gets to spend a year or two somewhere under sort of a visiting title, and I think they're doing more or less the same thing that they would be doing if they had a sort of a postdoctoral title as well. Last thing that I want to mention, so this is about finding it, right? Just recognize that there's some places that have these positions that are institutionalized, but then they come under very different names. And then there are other places where these are more informal or very, very ad hoc. Last thing that I want to mention is the fact that it really makes sense to, I think, to do a postdoc when there's a very clear goal, right? And again, my experience is idiosyncratic. I was transitioning and I was leaving political science behind. And I think that the best kind of proof of that is that I never tried to publish my dissertation. I think they really make sense if they're intended to start a collaboration. So right now, for the last couple of years, I've been thinking about ways I can find access to funding so that I can bring somebody from Europe with whom I have been talking about a research project, so that she and I can be co-located for ideally 2 years. I think that's a really big point. You need a year in which you don't have to worry about what you will be doing the year after that. And if it's with that intention in mind, I think it can be really, really a wonderful opportunity, because it allows two people who want to collaborate from the start to spend time together, to not worry about, at least for a brief period of time, like in academia, right? A year goes by really quickly. To not think about what comes next, and to develop the research and try to have a finished product at the end of it. So I'm going to stop there and happy to take any kind of questions you have.
Thank you, Cinzi. This was very enlightening and complementary to Louise's talk. Thank you very much. Let's then move to Panicos.
Yeah, thank you, Joao. Thank you, Louise and Cinziana, for your insights. Let me try to share my screen here. Let's see, just 1 minute. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Okay, perfect. Well, Joao put up my my academic headshot, so I had to add this to the slide. So the headshot is actually from the time I was a postdoc, from quite a while ago. I looked very different. My PhD experience was, I think, quite complementary to what Louise and Cinziana mentioned, in the sense that I did a postdoc, a more institutionalized postdoc. So I did my postdoc at the University of Michigan, and it was at the ERB Institute, which is a sustainability institute. It's a joint center between the business school and the School of the Environment. And it has been running now for several years. So I think a couple of decades already, if not more. So it's one of the oldest institutionalized postdocs probably in management. And I can tell a little bit about my personal story, and maybe give some kind of more general advice about, why do you do a postdoc, or why not? What are some of the trade-offs that you face in making the decision, and potentially improving the postdoc experience, both from the experience that I had, but also, some things that I wish I had done differently. Again, my experience was different because this is an institutionalized postdoc. I actually applied for a position. I applied for several postdocs. So when it was a year to, so when I was in my end of the 4th year, beginning of the 5th, I realized that I didn't think I was ready to go on the job market. I felt like my papers would do well, but were not there yet. So I applied to 4 postdoctoral positions during that time. I got invited to 2, and eventually I didn't interview at 1 because I had already accepted at the University of Michigan. And it was a great experience for me. It gave me lots of time for research. So this is a postdoc that has no teaching obligations. So it was really 2 years to do research. It allowed me to build up my pipeline, which was one of my primary goals. I met some really smart people. I really enjoyed the research environment. So I was going to the strategy talks. I was going to the management organization talks. The ERB Institute had a research seminar on sustainability and management. So it was a really great experience, and I learned a lot. And I think compared to some other postdocs, and especially compared to Louise's experience, funding was not an issue there, in the sense the funding was actually pretty good. It was not a huge difference from my first faculty position, although it would be very different from some of the top US schools in terms of salary, but still it was not a constraint for me. Now, why do you do a postdoc? And I think here I would add another thing. So based on Cinziana's experience, so if you want to switch to another discipline, I think that might be a very good stepping stone, of course. But another one is, of course, to build up your pipeline, to expand your network and start new projects, to elevate your status, kind of send the right signals, and of course, we can discuss to what extent you should do a postdoc if it's just about, you need the money. Now, if I start with the first one, I think it's reasonable to think about a postdoc if you're confident that your papers are going to be of high quality, but you need more time to get them out. That you think that if you go now, you'll be kind of selling. If you go now in the job market, you would be selling yourself short. But if you go in, a couple of years, then that would make a difference. So I think that could be one reason to do a postdoc. And in that sense, what you could look for in a postdoc is if it provides sufficient time for research. So sometimes, some postdocs might come with quite heavy teaching load. In that sense, it might not serve this particular purpose. And of course, does it provide the right infrastructure and environment, databases, access to data, access to people that you could work with for your own research. Now, Another reason might be, as I said, to expand your network and start new projects with different people. So you want to start collaborations and start building your second big project, beyond your dissertation. And of course, this could be complementary goals, right? It doesn't mean that you have only one goal, but usually we're driven more by one thing. And in this case, I would say that you should be looking for postdocs that offer a good fit in terms of the research that you want to do and that you like. Are the professors there, are they working on similar topics? Do you see any complementarities that you can exploit to work together? Think about what kind of research environment they have, even the PhD program. Often you may end up working with some of the PhD students in the new place. And especially if you're working on a pre-specified project, and I think that's more relevant when we're talking about postdocs that are related to a grant. So, somebody got a big grant and they have funding to fund postdoctoral positions. Usually you have to work on that particular project. So think about, is this close enough to your research? And will you really be part of the team, right? So will you have like key responsibilities and be a co-author in that work, potentially even be a lead on a paper? Or is someone just looking for a glorified research assistant where, you'll be doing data collection and then it would be their work and you're kind of left on the outside? I don't think that happens often, but it does happen. So, when it's that kind of postdoc, it's important to look into this question. Well, another, I think, very common reason where you do a PhD, and I think Louise mentioned that, is that sometimes you come from a school that may not be sending a very strong signal of quality, or the signal of quality that you want to send. Just by the name of the school, people infer about the quality of the PhD program, the training that you've had. So you may want to go somewhere where it will kind of elevate your status. So are you going to a school of higher status, that has a better reputation than yours? And is it high enough that would make a difference, that it would be worth it if this is your goal? And again, this could be one of the goals. And the final one, of course, is you just need a job, right? So you need to fund 1 or 2 years of your life, and maybe you didn't find faculty positions, or you think you have no opportunities to get funding from your PhD program. I think in general, if this is the only goal, it's generally better to stay in your PhD program, because there are some trade-offs related to going for a postdoc and not getting something out of it. And I'll talk about that later, but of course, that's one of the considerations. So, and here I'm just going with symmetric causality. If we assume that these are true, if we take them as true, then why not do a postdoc? Well, if it doesn't provide much time for research, there's no fit with your topic, with your interests, the target school is not better than yours, and you could fund the extra time for your research in your program, those might be reasons to just not go for a postdoc and maybe stay in your PhD program. Now, assuming that these are the kind of two options, obviously there are monetary trade-offs in terms of the funding that you might get. And I think in general, as a PhD student myself, and what I see in general is that we tend to overestimate the importance of money in the PhD program because you don't have much. But once you get a faculty position, it's usually, especially in the US, it's usually so much more than it might be worth, losing some money or even getting a loan early on if it's going to help you later. And that's important because of how people think about time and potentially increased expectations. So if you go for a postdoc and you get papers out or get papers in R&R, that definitely helps. If you go for a postdoc and you don't get anything out of it, that might actually hurt you on the job market because people see that you had more time and didn't have anything to show for it. And of course, there are trade-offs in terms of the network and opportunities that you get that you would get more if you go to a new place. Another one is that, again, because you have this extra time, it increases your chances of getting tenure. But of course, your tenure clock starts later. So it might also delay your tenure, which, you know, it's not necessarily a big problem, but for some people, you know, you sometimes want that certainty, especially if you have, you know, family and kids and you don't want to be moving around. That's one consideration. And of course, there are some personal trade-offs. So when I did the postdoc, I was lucky because my partner was in academia. It was easy for her to arrange to come as kind of in a visiting position at the University of Michigan as well. But I can imagine that others may have to move their partners who have less mobile jobs. They might have kids and have to think about, you know, an additional language or a new school for the kids and so on. And these are, I think, these trade-offs are a little bit challenging because you're not moving for 5-6 years. It's not that you can tell your partner, oh, yes, you have to you should switch your job and find a new job there. If you're moving for a couple of years, it's a bigger ask. In terms of making the most of your time, I think, you know, in general, I think it's great to try to be part of the community. I think Cinziana mentioned a lot of things that she did that would be great to do. So, you know, as I mentioned, I was going to seminars from different groups in the university. I didn't take any doctoral courses there, but I would have if I would do it again. I would ask for an office that is close to the group that you want to interact with. So I was in a postdoc that had other postdocs, so that we had like our own community in a sense. But most of the time, you go to a postdoc and you're the only one there. If you also have an office that's somewhere really far, it kind of makes things difficult. And we know, you know, there's research that shows that people are more likely to collaborate if they're close enough, or to become friends or get married or and so on. So, you know, if there's any option of having an office closer, try to do that. And in general, it's good to be proactive in reaching out to others, asking for help. People are generally very, very willing to talk to you if you're new to the school. And even if building a network or new projects is not your primary goal, I think it's still worth spending some time to do that. So yeah, overall, I think the postdoc can be a great experience. It was for me, and I hear for many others. And I think it is worth going for it, but make sure that it's for the right reasons and it fits your expectations. So that's all for me. I'll stop here and happy to take questions later.
Thank you, Panicos. Very comprehensive presentation. Why to do a postdoc? Why not? Yeah, very glad. Now we move to our last speaker of the day before the Q&A portion, Leandro.
Thank you, João. I'm sharing my screen. And let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can see, but it's not in full. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. So again, thanks for inviting me, João. Thanks, Louise, Cinziana, and Panicos for the previous presentations. I think all our presentations are quite complementary, and I think many of the things, especially that Panicos touched upon, they seem very important. And I'll be the only postdoc speaking here among the 4 speakers. And I agree with all of them in saying that these experiences, they tend to be very idiosyncratic. So I'll start first by like introducing a bit of what I've done so far, how I got here. And then I'll try to talk a little bit also about like the profiles of postdocs that I've seen in business school so far. And this is in fact becoming more common, but it is still quite unusual, I would say. So essentially, I have a PhD in business economics from INSPER, a business school in São Paulo. I defended roughly 1 year ago. And my research is essentially at the intersection of business and social impact. So I do research in things like CSR, social environmental impact, and so on. And I've got this position at the SNO Institute at HEC Paris roughly 1 year ago, since March last year. And so again, my postdoc is with an institute within the school. So the SNO Institute is a pretty large institute that spans several departments at ETC. And I'd say that the strategy department concentrates most of the professors, maybe because Rodolphe Durand, who founded the center, he's actually from the strategy department. But we have professors from accounting, even from finance, marketing, economics. So it is a pretty diverse center. And it matches pretty well with my research interests. And this is the primary reason why I tried a position here. So in my case, there wasn't really a formal position open at the time, but my advisors at INSPER, they knew Rodolphe personally. So then they sent an email to Rodolphe. And I was lucky because he was actually looking for someone with my profile. And it also helped because I had already some experience working with research centers in business schools that deal with partners. So in my previous business school, we have this great center, which is similar to the SNO, but smaller, where we do many projects with like organizational partners to measure impact, to help them figure out social impact. And so I was used to those interactions. And I think this also helped me get this position because I've been doing this also in the projects here at the SNO, in some of them. So why I wanted to do a postdoc in the first place? Essentially two reasons, and I think both of them were covered by my colleagues before me. So first I wanted to expand my network, and this is especially important when you come from a country like Brazil, because we are a bit isolated. It is inevitable, right? So the communities are much bigger in the US and Europe. So it's harder to actually be a part of the research community being far away. So I spent 1 year of my PhD in the US, but I wanted to internationalize my career more. And so I see a postdoc as a great opportunity for that. And also because I wanted to strengthen my research pipeline, and the postdoc gives you a good time to do that. I used essentially the first 2 months of my postdoc to work on R&Rs that I had. If I needed more time, I would probably be able to, because my postdoc is flexible in terms of time. But yeah, it was pretty helpful, and I could like convert those R&Rs and then start thinking about new projects. So I think this the time you gain if you go to the right postdoc position can be really, really valuable. So what is expected from a postdoc in a business school, right? So I would describe here essentially 3 profiles that I know. I'm pretty sure there are more profiles out there. You may also be able to mix them up, but these three main profiles are like profiles that I've seen quite a lot. So you see that all of these profiles, of course, have an element of research, right? So this is like the primary objective is still doing research, but you are also expected to do something else. So we see, for example, as I think Panicos mentioned, many postdocs have a teaching load. In other postdocs, you're hired to be essentially an RA. I think Panicos also touched on that. So you are expected, for example, to do data work or to help the supervisor with some sort of data analysis. Even though you won't be a part of the project, you won't be a co-author, for example, so that project will not come into your pipeline, right? And then the third profile, which is the profile that my job fits in, is really where when you go for a postdoc at a research center, like or an institute, and then you have projects to pursue within the institute. So these are projects that generally involve like essentially non-academic ideas or jobs per se, but they need someone from academia to like bring insights or to even evaluate things or to make like a brief literature review and then sum up the findings to the non-academic audience. So these projects involve interactions essentially with practitioners, right? And this is exactly what I do mostly at the SNO, although much more of my time is devoted to research. So I would say that each of these profiles has like pros and cons, right? So the con, I would say it is that you cannot only do research most of the times. I've heard about positions that that give you like 100% of the time for do your research, but I think those are quite rare. I mean, I don't know many people who have been there. I think Louise is an example, and I wasn't aware of prior to. But I think mostly you see positions that require some sort of work besides research, right? And so if you have to teach, for example, this can be valuable because you can get some teaching experience that you may not have gotten in your program. In case of projects like the ones I work here at the SNO, this is pretty nice because it gives me an opportunity to understand whether and how practitioners value my research, you know. So I get insight on, for example, research ideas that practitioners would value more. I also get to test things like ask questions, you know, like say, well, what do you think about this? And someone who's answering maybe, for example, the manager of a large company, which is usually pretty insightful for someone doing research in strategy. So I see like lots of pros in all of them. But I think there are also a few things that you should keep an eye to if you are considering applying for a postdoc position, right? So the first thing is try to know the profile of the job you're applying to ex ante. I mean, determine the profile to avoid like frustrations later, you know, like try to see whether your, for example, the job will require teaching and in how much of teaching and in which areas of teaching. Make sure that if, for example, the terms are not that clear, make sure that you won't be just an RA, for instance, because this may also happen. And it may be painful for you to work on a research that it's not yours. So you should start the program knowing exactly what to expect, right? The second tip is pay very close attention to the time devoted to your research. So try to negotiate at least 50% of the time. So as I said here at the SNO, I have much more than that to do research, and it's great. But some positions, for example, that have teaching loads, they may have heavy teaching loads, and then you may not have time to do your own research. So try to negotiate ex ante to have this time available. And finally, be aware that postdocs are still uncommon in business schools. So this is important because while it is getting more and more common, we still see at least for me, things that at least for me are frustrating. So for example, I know that some job market consortia in our field do not accept postdocs, right? And this is like, to me, it's crazy because postdocs are not very different from PhD candidates, for instance, especially if you go in the market, go for a postdoc as I did, like I defended in the middle of my 4th year, as Louise also. So I didn't stay in the PhD program for like very long and then went for a postdoc. And so I don't see why, for example, I should not be allowed to participate in such a consortium, for instance, but I've heard stories already. So this type of thing, which stems essentially from your position being a bit indefinite, you know, like neither a professor nor a PhD candidate. These things can happen and they can be quite frustrating, so you have to be prepared for that. And this is it. Before I finish, I just want to say that the SNO Institute is actually hiring postdocs. So they have 2 positions open and the deadline is close. It's like 5 days from now. So if you're doing research in CSR, sustainability, social impact more broadly, consider applying. It is a great research environment. And Paris is also pretty nice to live. So thank you. I'll finish here.
Thank you, Leandro. So I think we had very nice presentations all in all today, and we do have a few questions here in the chat, but I wanted first to see if anyone wants to ask a question. I see that Monash Bora has a question, so you have the word.
Am I audible?
Hello.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you all for such a good presentation. I'm in the 4th year of my PhD, and I'm doing my PhD from Indian Institute of Management, Ranchi. So I'm also looking for a postdoc in the coming year or 6 months. So I wanted to ask a few questions regarding how to get the postdoc. Like you all have talked about what are the different scenarios involving how postdocs have been conducted or how it's done. But I wanted to ask, like, how can we ensure that our applications get accepted? For example, what should be the key points in the cover letter that we write, or how should we send a package of attachment or everything that is needed to ensure that wherever we are applying, we get the postdoc. For example, I am from an institute which is not an accredited institute like a WSSB or something like that. So in that regard, I have those questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So who would like to take this question?
Well, I can make some comments on it. I think for all of the formal positions, there will always be a specification about what you need to include in a package. So you need to include a CV, and you need to have a cover letter and all those things. And then there may be specific requirements. I know at CBS, I think they always require to see your prior degrees. So if you have certificates of your degrees and so on. And then it's very good to have some recommendation letters. And then I think also we talked a lot about the network. So if anybody on your committee knows someone, if they could send an email to vouch for you or say, look, I would like to recommend this person, and I think they would do a great job in a postdoc position, then I think that's always helpful.
And to add one more thing to what Louise mentioned, I think because postdocs are so idiosyncratic and very often they're looking for something very specific, I think signaling the fit with what they want is even more important than for faculty positions, where again it's important to do that. But I think for postdocs, sometimes it's just like a very specific research area. So making sure that you signal that fit can be very useful.
I want to complement a little bit Manash's question, because Panicos alluded to the importance of being proactive while you are in a postdoc. I'm wondering if there's a way to be proactive in the application. Let's say in case your supervisors are not socialized enough or not willing to vouch for you, regardless of how good quality your work is, are there any things candidates can do to try to overcome these limitations? In your opinion, of course, there's no right answer.
No, I think, Joao, I think the advice on being clear on the fit and how your interests fit with that particular position is important. And then I think also, it was Leandro who said, make sure at least there's 50% time for your own research projects. But at the same time, it's also important to indicate that you will have time to work on if it's a particular project or position that you're applying for. Because I recently was involved in interviewing some doctoral students who were applying for postdocs. And with some of them, we thought they were a great fit, but we were concerned they already had so many projects they were working on with other people that they would enter the postdoc and not have time to do anything other than responding to R&Rs or working on existing projects. And then of course then you are taking someone on who won't have time to work on the project, and that's less desirable for the person who's hiring.
So for my postdoc, I also had to submit the one I was accepted, that I also had to submit a proposal for what I'm going to do during the postdoc. And I think some postdocs have that, maybe not many.
I see. And just a question that Heather has written here, Leandro has mentioned that his supervisors had contacts at HSC Paris when he got his postdoc. What about you, Panicos? Was this also somehow through network?
Well, I kind of went through the formal channels of applying, but one of my committee members and one of the people who gave me a recommendation letter is in the network of Andy Hoffman and Tom Lyon, who were running the institute. So I'm sure that helped getting a recommendation letter from someone that they know well and they can trust.
Of course. So I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking, the scenario that I mentioned of someone who is in a school that's not so well known internationally, or whose supervisors are not willing to vouch. Perhaps one way to be proactive is going to conferences, trying to socialize and present your work and show it has good fit with some of these more high status or legitimate institutions. I'm putting quotes here in the air. So
I actually want to add also to that, Sean. I was going to talk about conferences. They are quite important, and now they're coming to person again, and so it's very helpful. But another thing that helps is to during the PhD, you may want to try to make connections outside your school. Like try to spend a time visiting a professor at another institution, and then perhaps have a project together, so you get a recommendation letter from them. These things are quite valuable, and they can help, especially if your school is smaller or less known. So this is something I did in my PhD program, and my colleagues in the PhD program did the same, and it seems to work quite well.
Thank you. We have two questions in the chat that have to do with legitimacy or the status of the schools where you get your PhD. So Rafael Crispin, for example, is asking the panelists to expand on legitimacy and status elevation. So what kind of signals are business schools searching in candidates for assistant professor positions, and how the postdoc may help achieving that? And then Tomas Teodorovics also wanted some elaboration on good and bad types of postdocs and how higher prestige can be helpful to candidates.
I can say something about that. I think, I think it's easier to know this when you're on the other side, when you're in recruiting committees. But I think most of us, have the intuition that if you receive a CV, if you're looking for someone for a faculty position eventually, and you receive a CV of someone from Stanford, you make a lot of inferences about the quality of the program and the quality of the training, right? If you receive it from, what do I name? The University of Cyprus, let's say, you don't know that program. You don't know if it's good or not. So, whether it's good or bad, high status schools, provide an advantage to whoever has that, stamp on their CV. That's what I was trying to convey.
I want to add to that. So I completely agree with Panicos, right? That there is a signaling value to the institution that is attached to your postdoc, or where you're spending your postdoc. But I think it's also really important to recognize that these very high status institutions, people are so overwhelmed by everything else and everything that they have to do. They have their own research. Teaching is very, very time intensive. They have a ton of surveys that they have to do, and they get all sorts of requests that they have to figure out, how to handle. So it's also very possible that you can end up at a very high status institution where nobody has time to work with you. And I think that's something that's really important to consider, because if all you're looking for in a postdoc is to put a better institution on top of sort of your CV, so that your PhD institution or the value of your PhD gets enhanced by the name of the institution where you're spending a postdoc. If that's all you're looking for, then that's fine. But if what you're looking for is an opportunity to enhance your education and walk away with having learned something, or if you're looking for an opportunity to spend a lot of time on research, working with someone very, very closely, then you have to make sure that those opportunities are there before you join, because otherwise it could be simply sort of time in which you might as well have been better off staying either at your current institution for another year, if that's an opportunity, or doing something, you know, starting in an academic position.
I think that's an excellent point, Cincy, because it's also, you know, when I did my postdoc, it was partly because INSEAD had a reputation of being a teaching school, and it was at that time not clear, did people even do coursework, which we did even back then. So for me, it was, you know, to spend more time on the research and about a signal also about the seriousness about the research. And I was fortunate because I got to be at MIT, but I think you can also do that at other schools. So it's about getting that extra time to spend on your research. So that is certainly possible. And I think you're absolutely right. You could go to a great school, and if no one has time for you, then I'm not sure how much you're really going to get out of it. And is it really worth it then?
I have a note to participants. If you want to ask your question yourself, please raise your hands. Otherwise, I'll keep asking the questions in the chat myself. I have a question, actually. So my experience, it's elaborating on what you said. In my experience, I didn't do a postdoc, but I went to the University of Minnesota for a year because my co-supervisor was there. And I remember when I was talking to people, many people said, wow, you're from HEC Paris and you know econometrics. So you guys have courses in econometrics there. Oh my, you know, so that was a big surprise for many people there. And so I was wondering, are there other ways for people to overcome this perception that may not be in line with reality? And if you could reflect on longer PhDs versus going for a postdoc or visiting positions during the PhD, if you have any thoughts about these issues.
So I think visiting position could also be a good, and I think we didn't discuss it, but maybe Leandro touched upon it. A visiting position can be a good entry point also for a postdoc, because I think in general, the visiting position is easier to arrange. You know, Cinziana is right, like people have like a lot of demands. So it's not necessary that if you want to go somewhere, they will, you know, they will be willing to take you, right? They want to take people that they will spend time with as well. But in general, going somewhere for a visit is easier because it doesn't require as much funding, and sometimes it doesn't require any funding. So it's easier to get someone to say, yes, come for a few months or for 6 months or a year. And, you know, maybe something comes out of it, maybe not. But then if you go somewhere and then you get to know them and you show that, you know, you're good and you have those skills that you mentioned, Joao, then it's easier to get a postdoc in that place, or to get, you know, a recommendation letter, or to get something that will allow you to go for a postdoc somewhere else.
Anyone else? If Cincy?
I want to answer Heather's question from the beginning about salaries, because I think this is an important one and there's a lot of variance. So I don't want to get ahead of things, but I want to volunteer to answer that question when the time comes. Should I go ahead now, or?
Yes. I was going to move to more practical things, like what are the salaries at postdocs, how they compare, you know, to visiting positions, as well as Dimit Simonin's question that his country has grants for postdocs and how advantageous that can be when someone sends an application. So I think these are connected issues, but let's go with salaries first.
So I didn't see the second question. I think the second question is really good. If you can self-fund it, that gives you so much flexibility, right? Because at that point, you're essentially turning it into a question of a visiting position, right? So I have the money, I can support this ideally from a research institution in my home country, from a research grant in my home country, and I can go somewhere for a year or 2 or 3 years, what is the right institution that can host? And then you look for fit, and you look for collaborations, and you look for other things. If the postdoc is about where do I find the resources, the money to pay for, you know, I think it was it Leandro or Panicos that had a meme about I'm passionate about not starving. If it's about that, then it becomes a completely different calculus. And what the only thing that I wanted to suggest here is that you try to find out what the host institution that you're hoping to be affiliated with pays an adjunct for a course. And I think that's a really helpful benchmark, because you can, I mean, whether it's whether the postdoc involves teaching responsibilities or not, you can still use that as to figure out how much money they are paying you and whether that's reasonable. And I mean, it's oftentimes the case that those are the funds available. You can't negotiate. Like it's a take it or leave it kind of situation. But it's really helpful to know what an adjunct receives for a course that the institution absolutely has to fill. And it's probably somewhere between the equivalent of a course and a half, in best case scenarios, maybe 2 courses, so 2 times what an adjunct would receive, even if you don't do any teaching, even if you do just 1 course. So I think that's a really helpful, for me, at least in my mind, as I think about how, again, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of someone who's trying to find funds to bring someone over to continue a research collaboration.
I can add that in the US, in state schools, so long as an employee, at least here in South Carolina, when an employee makes more than $50,000 a year, you can easily check, the annual pay of that employee. So if you know of anyone who's doing a postdoc in one state institution in the US, there are ways for you to get an approximate number value for what that person is making out of state funds in that institution. So I would go with that. And it's similar to Canada, where you can see all employees in research universities, how much they're making. So I'll go about that with that. But private schools have no idea how one could know.
In some other countries, it's also regulated. For example, in the Netherlands, the salary for postdocs is regulated, so you know exactly what range you would have. And some other countries as well have that.
Yes, and I think, this is very practical, but if someone is hired as a postdoc in the US as a foreigner and comes with an H-1B visa, which is the work visa, there are also ways to get an understanding, not by name, but how much an institution is paying someone with a given position, because this is all regulated and will be available online. So,
João, this is a good point you brought up that I wanted to touch upon. So I believe all postdocs are in the US. They are under the G1 status. So it's pretty. I would say I've never seen anyone as a postdoc in the H-1B, and this is another issue that I think people should consider, because many times if you go with a scholarship from your country, depending on who is paying for that, if it is, for example, your federal government, you may get a ban on your J1 visa in the US, and this then can create problem for you to stay in the US if you, for example, find a tenure-track job. So study a little bit the situation before applying, because while it is certainly easy to go if you have funding, there are also trade-offs like this one that I just mentioned that may actually make your experience worse. So I didn't actually happen to me, but when I spent my year visiting Utah in my PhD program, I went with a J1, and then I had like a 2-year ban, and I couldn't get a J1 in the US in the next 2 years. So these things are quite, they're quite bad, and they are enforceable. So you have to think about it also when you consider applying.
That's very good point. I actually had the same issue with my J1 visa from Minnesota, but was able to get a waiver. But yes, something to consider, immigration concerns of whatever you are applying for your postdoc, if you're a foreigner. Okay, do we have other questions in the chat? Or I can move. Tomas Theodorovich was asking if panelists can share tips on how to avoid being in a limbo in the university where you're doing your postdoc, since you're not a PhD, you're not a faculty member, who are you? You know, how to avoid this limbo situation.
I just want to say it's a great question. I think it's really hard, right? And I can speak from experience. I was not a PhD student when I was at Wharton, and found it very difficult to connect with the PhD students because, again, they were having a very different experience and they had their own cohort. And I was definitely not a faculty member. So I went, there were, at the time, Wharton would have sort of informal lunches with faculty members, and I was encouraged to go. I went a few times. I was so intimidated. And it, you know, you go, and then you're like, okay, I'm just going to stay and do my own research in the office. So it's very difficult. You know, I think joining the formal events that are offered by the department, of course, going to seminars, that, you know, I think these things are really, really important, and then just scheduling coffee chats with everybody until you become a little bit more integrated based on personal relationships and building up from there. It's hard.
Can I also just add, I think you're right, it's very hard, and you ultimately you will be stuck in between, but I think you have also graduated with your PhD at that point. And so I think it's a great time for you to transition out of that role. It's also hard when you start as a junior faculty to transition out of the role of being a PhD student. But I think some of the advice that Cindy gave of joining different things and so on, I must say the one advantage you have, you know, I was at MIT and I was not on the faculty, and I didn't think I was going to be on the faculty. So I didn't have to be concerned about asking questions in seminars and so on, whereas the junior faculty were concerned because the senior faculty were observing them. So I think you also have advantages as a postdoc, right? You're in between, but you're not probably often not staying there as a faculty member later.
Okay, so I mean, I wanted to move, we still have like 10 minutes, but I wanted to get back to something Cindy mentioned in her talk about many postdocs have an objective to promote diversity, let's say, to somehow boost that aspect in the academic departments. How effective are they? So have you observed this as being an effective approach to promote diversity, or? Yes, if you can reflect a little more on this. Anyone, not Cindy necessarily.
I mean, I can start because we have this, it's called a Provost's Fellowship for postdoctoral research. And it's across all fields. So it can be, you know, from humanities and social sciences to science and technology. And there's a very broad application process at first, and the person applying has to identify faculty members who are willing to serve as mentors. We've had, I think at this point, 2 people come through our department, or a department that's sponsored by the provost. The record is mixed. It's really, you know, it's really, really hard. It's a combination of, I mean, for a combination of reasons. In both of the people who came through here, they are also transitioning from a different field. And that by itself is a tricky experience. You know, I've been through it, I know exactly how challenging it can be. And then there are other considerations too. So I think the effort is worthwhile. Universities have become a lot more mindful about these issues, but it's also a pipeline problem, right? And there is it's going to take time.
I think it's a great opportunity. I think definitely it's a great way to use postdocs to try and increase diversity. But I think it's also becoming more competitive. It's becoming more common to do a postdoc, and that means there will be competition. And we all know that when there's competition, there are biases that enter the recruitment process, and that may work against diversity, unfortunately. Hopefully that won't happen, but I think if conscious efforts are made to use the postdoc positions in that way, I think that's a great opportunity. Yeah.
Great. Well, I just want to take the last 2 minutes to thank Louise, Cinz, Panicos, and Leandro for sharing all these experiences with us today. I think everyone will agree that we learned a lot about postdocs today and your personal experiences. It was very enlightening. And also want to thank Heather Berry for having the idea and being here all the time today. I know how busy both Heather and Louise are with the AOM conference reviews and all of that. So thank you very much, especially to you two. And everyone, thank you. I hope you enjoyed. The video will be posted online in the STR division page, so you can enjoy all of this in posterity as well. Thank you.